Yeah, so, and you look at the forces you cited, the size, and I haven't heard the phrase before, heard military industrial complex, but medical industrial complex, but it's true, right? I mean, it's a behemoth that's almost beyond comprehension. And then you see legislators that are now hell-bent on, militarizing action towards fighting a virus, right? Which now basically starts to create resources, fear, agendas, all these types of things. So yeah, I think it does accelerate a lot of the bad things about what's driving us towards extinction. What do you think our timeline is? I mean, what is it that we would have to do, and in what period of time would we have to do it to salvage the situation?
First, I should start by saying the science right now is really keeps us in suspension right now as to whether there is actually an opportunity for us to get out of the extinction event. So I think that the predominance of the information right now at the human genomics and microbiome level is that it's too late. We've already set in motion the biologic events that are unfolding, and they are embedded in our genes. One of my areas of expertise is in this intersection between glyphosate and the herbicides and human health, and how they cross-sect. And in my recent work, testifying before the EPA with their public session on glyphosate, we demonstrated, over 96 different, peer-reviewed science articles that have come out in just the last 3 years, and then a whole data bank of, previous 30 years of science that is pointing to the fact that we've already, through our genetic engineering of crops to tolerate more and more toxic stews of chemicals, we have already set in motion the epigenetic patterns in humans that will lead to our extinction. And this is demonstrated in mouse models where you, at F0, which is the first generation, if you give a transient exposure of glyphosate to that mother while there's a child in utero, the F1 generation, that first generation after that transient exposure, they don't have any more glyphosate in their food. They're not exposed to glyphosate or RoundUp again, but that one in mom sets into motion metabolic events in F1 that are detrimental. So you start to see the emergence of chronic disease. By F2, you start to see fundamental collapse of metabolism. You see the emergence of obesity severe. You see the emergence of diabetes and other metabolic collapses of the neural systems, neurodegenerative conditions, and the like. And then by F3, you see fundamental collapse of the genome, in that we are now transitioning what is an accumulation of epigenetic and random genetic injuries that are accumulating in those first two generations. They transition to germline mutations in the third generations, which means they're now integrated into the sperm and the ovum and passed generation to generation. And so by the third generation, after transient exposure, let alone chronic exposure to glyphosate, we see the extinction level genetic injuries happen, where you get widespread, complete cessation of reproductive capacity and the like. And so the scary thing to me is that the first transient in utero exposures to glyphosate at significant levels was probably in moms that were birthing babies between 1996 and 2006. So that decade was kind of the beginning of this human experiment of what would unfold. And so we are only at F0 right now of exposing people to it. We are just starting to see the emergence of their children, right? And so their children are now in their teens, maybe they're single digits. And those children of that first generation of exposure have leapt in chronic disease already in F1. And so that chronic disease epidemic has gone from 1% to 4%, depending on which stats you read, from 1960s to current of 52, 54% in US, Germany, other Western countries, turning in numbers like this. We have an enormous burden with 1 in 2 children now with some sort of chronic disorder or disease. And that sounds like a ludicrous number. How's that possible? I know a whole bunch of healthy kids. But then if you go and ask those kids, do you have food allergies? Do you have, early onset menses? Do you have eczema? Do you have environmental sensitivities to pollens? Do you have an autoimmune condition? Have you been diagnosed with eczema, asthma? Do you have attention deficit? Suddenly you find out that all of those healthy kids that you're thinking of have a long list of diagnoses that have come into their purview. And so sadly, we're already seeing this burden of 52% in F1. F2, we get to see born after 2030. And so that 2 generations down the road, where we really see obesity, cancer, and metabolic collapse and neurologic, devastation in the mouse models, will start to play out in the humans at 2030. And then the F3, where we see germline mutations now, where we have transgenerational disease, those will appear in 2050. So in other words, we're 30 years away from really seeing the damage we've done to the human species. And that's scary because already in that first F0, F1 jump, we've seen a 57% decline in sperm levels in many industrialized countries. We have 1 in 3 males that are now infertile in the US and other Western countries due to low sperm counts. The book Countdown just came out, which focuses a lot on the drop in sperm counts, but spends most of its time talking about the impact of microplastics in the environment and endocrine disruptors. And I think perhaps maybe doesn't emphasize or find itself to this root cause of our food system literally put in play the genetic engineering necessary to allow us to toxify our body to create these generational toxicities that will accumulate and already are. And so in that way, the unfortunate answer is we don't know if we survive the actions we've already taken in regards to a chemical food system. And the pandemic is symptomatic of that. Why did 400,000 people die of a virus that's been in the environment for 780 years? People have theorized maybe it's militarized, maybe it's a gain of function thing. The fact is these coronaviruses, 2001 to 2012, 2018, 19, 20, we keep seeing coronaviruses appear in these annual pandemics, which are annual. We have flu, that's every year pandemic. We have, versions of echovirus, adenovirus. We have versions of norovirus. All these different families go around the world every year with new strains, new versions, and they cause an enormous amount of mortality that hasn't gotten the publicity that we've put on the SARS-CoV-2, but they certainly are there every year. And it is always the third, cause of death worldwide is respiratory death. And so it's a very consistent feature that we see disease emergence and patterns of disease. And I think it's foolhardy to think that we're not on this path to extinction as you just start to see the accumulation of chronic disease from 1960 to 1980 to 2000. Those 20-year jumps are enough to prove very definitively that we are on the verge of this complete collapse of biology.
Well, that's sobering, to say the least. What about pockets of civilization that, like the Amish, for example, people who lived in community, who have not engaged in, the modern practices, of farming and, live a different life that doesn't toxify in the way that, the rest of the world has been living. Obviously, they're affected insofar as the world, starts to collapse. There's all kinds of really bad things that go on. But do you think that people could take certain actions and try to separate themselves from this world in an effort to try to, survive into the future?
I would like to hold on to that romantic belief that somebody has been able to hold out and not be adopted into this chemical warfare mentality of food production. But unfortunately, those numbers are dwindling very rapidly. I work very closely with a Mennonite farmer who came out of a multi-generational farm experience. And by 2006, when he was trying to help manage this farm, he was totally disillusioned by the sheer amount of chemicals they were using. And he was sure they were going in the wrong direction as a Mennonite multi-generational farm. So when we think of, these groups that, surely are practicing traditional, farming practices, it turns out that they are already 2-3 generations into the slippery slope of farm inputs, chemical fertilizers, chemical herbicides and pesticides. And so their traditional understanding of soil management and things like that are generationally lost already. And so John's had to reinvent his entire, knowledge base of farming, leaving that multi-generational collapse. And so I see the possibility that perhaps in some far-flung part of the world, I was just in Fiji right at the beginning of the pandemic. I was in Fiji, and it was right at the beginning of lockdowns and the panic, and everybody in the United States had bought every last roll of toilet paper on the planet. And went over there in Fiji, like day 3 of global panic, I happened to be asked to go and buy health supplements for the Fijian staff at this retreat center that I was working at. And I went to the first stop was at the market to buy all of the groceries for the coming week for 40 people. And so we had this huge van, and we ran around with these incredible Fijian women who just like knew exactly what to get. And we were, armloads of onions and these incredible melons, and we had squash of all kinds. We had all these potatoes. We had massive amounts of food. And this market was open air market under this massive permanent, roof structure, outdoor marketplace. And it was literally like a football field's worth of tables literally overflowing with incredible vegetables. The unfortunate thing is there was no concept of organic or inorganic, processes towards any of those. And so here you are in one of these, developing economies, but the amount of glyphosate that is sold to these developing countries now is often exceeding that amount that farmers in the United States are using on their land, because there's been no effort to educate farmers to the long-term chemical damage to soil systems. They've been taught nothing about the damage to water retention within those soils as soon as they start applying these compounds and everything else. And so it's really like giving a backpack of RoundUp to a homeowner who then goes and sprays that stuff all over their driveway to kill 4 dandelions. The attitude of these chemical companies, especially in the developing world, is, oh, these farmers are too simple to know the science, so we'll just tell them to spray it, and so there's this disrespect for the indigenous wisdom that's growing the food, even in these incredible open markets, that we're eating far more glyphosate than you would hope for. And it's been by this kind of insidious creep of convenience of Western culture farming that allows farmers you can grow more land because you don't have to pick the weeds. You just spray this thing and you're done and you keep going. We're cutting down massive swaths of the Amazon right now to plant genetically engineered corn from Bayer and the like. And so unfortunately, the time has probably passed where we have some enclave of indigenous, peoples that are really practicing a true original, art of soil management. Perhaps more frightening than that is there is no survival past the planet itself. The extinction event of humans is symptomatic of the collapse of biology on the planet, not of human biology. Human biology and its collapse is symptomatic of the destruction that we are playing out on our soil microbes, on the virome itself. So as we oppose nature at its fundamental thresholds of source, we start to collapse life everywhere. So it's not like, oh, these humans are sick over here, but these ones will stay healthy because they're doing that. No humans can survive because we are poisoning the rivers, the lakes, the oceans of the world simultaneously. Rainfall is a good example of this. You measure rainfall in the United States now, 85%, 87% is positive for glyphosate and 37 other herbicides and pesticides. And then you look at the air we breathe, 77% is contaminated with glyphosate and 20 other herbicides and pesticides suspended in the air. And so we have lost the opportunity to protect a single enclave, largely because of the mechanisms of the planet. Water, soil, and air systems are global. They are not an isolated event.
Thanks so much for being here and watching that video. And can I ask you to please subscribe to our channel so you can find out when we're posting new content. You'll be alerted right away when we do. To share this with people you think might benefit from the information, and certainly it helps us if you like the video. So if you like what you just saw, go ahead and hit that like button. And again, thank you so much for being here with me right now.